All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our first education policy brown bag for the spring semester, our fourth that we have hosted so far this year. I'm very excited to introduce a friend and colleague of mine. For those who don't know me, my name is Jacob Kirksey. I'm an assistant professor in the Educational Leadership Policy program in the College of Education at Texas Tech. And this brown bag, if this is your first, is really an effort on the ed policy faculty side to, promote cross-pollination, share ideas in a virtual setting, as our program is largely virtual. And as we all are very familiar with now, COVID has necessitated a lot of things move to virtual. So thank you for dedicating your lunch hour and sharing that with us. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Ethan Hutt is an assistant professor in the School of Education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hills. His research focuses on the relationship between schools, the law, and education policy. Specifically, he is interested in the historical development, modern use, and ongoing effects of the metrics we use to describe and evaluate our schools. Whether it's students' grades, standardized test scores, or measures of effective teaching metrics are embedded everywhere in our school system. Ethan's research asks, where did these metrics come from? How did they become central to the work of schools? And what effects have their use had on how we think about what schools do and how well they do it? In answering these questions, Ethan's research often takes a historical approach that emphasizes the role of law and policy in shaping these developments. Dr. Hutt has received several accolades in recognition of his work, including the prestigious postdoc fellowship from the National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation, a recent grant from the National Science Foundation, among others. In addition to publishing his scholarship in high-impact academic journals, Dr. Hutt's work has also been featured in popular media outlets like Chalkbeat, Education Next, The Atlantic, and the New York Times. I am very pleased to turn it over to Dr. Hutt for today's talk titled, What Can't We See? Considering Instructional Quality in an Era of Increasing Standards. Thanks, Ethan.
There it is. Got too many windows open. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to get, 2 years on Zoom. You'd think I'd have it done by now. Thanks so much, guys, for joining. And I'll just say off the bat that I'm going to do this informally. And so if I say something, I talk too fast, my audio goes bad, just jump in, just unmute yourself, jump in, ask a question, and we'll go from there. So thanks for the introduction. You did my first slide for me. I just want to introduce myself. If you're not familiar with my work at all, I'm really interested, as Jacob said, in the historical development and current use of school metrics. So that's sort of my perspective. So I've done history of grading, testing, the GED. My new work is on the history of longitudinal data sets. Maybe some of you use those things like ELs and NELs and high school and beyond and all that stuff. And so I'm interested in sort of where did those things come from? How did they develop? And then kind of how do we use them? What kind of information do they give off? And what do they let us see and not see? And so that's kind of a big theme in my work. As Jacob also said, I do a lot of contemporary stuff too. For those of you doctoral students, graduate students, I think it's possible to work at the intersection of multiple fields and multiple areas. So, I fashion myself as a historian, but I also, follow my metrics into the present. And so I've done some work on value-added measures, in particular, how courts and judges understand the information provided by a value-added measure. Like, how does that help them think about what teachers do or what happens in schools? I've done work on releasing public data and kind of what does that mean? EdTPA with Jacob and Jessica, who maybe is on the maybe on the call, I don't know. And then also work on attendance metrics, both in the past and the present. So I've done a little bit of everything, and you'll see that maybe come through in kind of how I think about this stuff. One of the nice things about working with metrics is I get to work with really interesting people across fields. And so I just want to start this work I'm going to present to you today. There is a paper version of it that's out there. And so I'm happy to, if I intrigue you with anything I say, I'm happy to give you the full version in the paper form. And so I just want to take a second to acknowledge my co-authors, Julie Cohen, and two of her graduate students, Rebecca Berlin and Emily Wiseman. They did really tremendous work on this. And then this was also funded research And you'll see part of it is theoretical, part of it is empirical, and working with Washington, D.C. and the Student Achievement Partner. So lots of people to thank. I can't take credit for all of this, though my co-authors aren't here. So if I say something and you object, I will just blame them. So let that be a lesson. I'm just joking. Okay, so a little bit of background just to get us into the sort of intuitions on this paper and what's happening. I think almost everyone here has some familiarity with Common Core, and though I'll use Common Core in this talk, I don't actually think it turns on Common Core. I'm a historian, and I can tell you that this is a recurring theme in American history. This idea that we need to be tougher. We need to strengthen our standards. We need to make it better. So Common Core got this treatment. Common Core algebra seen as tougher. Common Core lessons aim to close the achievement gap, right? We got equity, we got excellence. This is like, you could drop this headline in from any time, basically since the 1960s. We're concerned about equity, we're concerned about excellence and improving standards. The new math is now the old math is now that, so it goes all the way back. And this is a recurring theme. And we get this sort of this rhetoric. We even got the international flavor. Public education systems in the US were falling behind South Korea, Canada, Norway, all the usual suspects until the new PISA comes out, and then it'll be a different set of suspects. And so the idea of standards as a mechanism for driving attention and improving quality, and then doing everything else, achievement gap, excellence, equity, the whole bit. So that's like kind of the background that Common Core, that's the rhetoric, that's the intent of the policy. And then, of course, in the typical American fashion, right, we say, okay, we want to do this. And as you all know, but it's never, I think, never foolish to say out loud, right? We have these efforts. And in this case, right, facilitated through a national foundation, facilitated through the federal government, but it was individual states that got the choice. But even then, right, in Texas, in North Carolina, where I am, in California, where I grew up, even when we're trying to be deliberative and move together as a state or a country, we still end up with standards that have these incredibly open quality to them, right? So you see this as a Common Core grade 4, and what are the practices that we want to do? We're going to achieve all these goals with what? You look at these things, reason abstractly and quantitatively. Okay, that is an admirable practice, that's an admirable goal, but that's so far from a pedagogy. It's not even really a specific set of practices. It's sort of like a genre of practices. And so, we don't get anywhere close, despite the rhetoric of what we want to do. We sort of take these baby steps and we get this really wide open thing, which is absolutely a function of what we realize is this decentralized nature of our school system, of our states, of all the things that we know happen kind of downstream of the policy sphere here. So we end up with these really open-ended practices, and many people would say by design, right? We for those of you who are like scholars of school reform, right? A standard argument is like, well, we need to allow for hybridization. We need to allow for the adaptation of things to local circumstances. And so it's not necessarily a critique, but it's just an observation about like, how do we actually get to these things? And so what happens when you have these open-ended sort of choose your own adventure kind of policies is, then you get the sort of interpretation of, okay, what is it that's going on here? So you get divergent views. How Gates Foundation push for high quality curriculum will stifle teaching. Okay, this is about prescriptive teaching, the death of the creative teaching. But then you can equally find people who will say, it's not A. So Common Core poses big challenge for students, but a big opportunity for teachers. You also get, teachers will see this interdisciplinary opportunity. This is going to be the new bold frontier. This isn't stifling creativity. This is unlocking potential. This is giving license to do things that we could never do before, right? So, again, this is a function of the openness of the reform itself, right, of the standards. And so you get this kind of like, what is it? Is it stifling, or is it unlocking opportunity? And that's just a function of it, right? The next thing that happens though downstream, right, is, okay, when the rubber meets the road at individual districts, they have to figure out which is it, right? Is it prescriptive or not prescriptive, right? And so what you see, and this is exactly what we saw with Common Core, and again, that's the example because we were working with DCPS, but you could really sub in, I think, any standards that we've in the whole history of American curriculum, right? So people say, okay, this reform is coming, we got to do something. And so you end up having these trainings, right? These sort of third party and district-based trainings to try to bridge the gap between the openness of the standard and what's actually going to happen in districts, right? So where I was at Maryland before I was at North Carolina, where I am now, right? And so Prince George's County was doing all these things. And I think it's notable. It's like well, one, I love the EdSource headline of mostly well aligned. That's like that's what we strive for in the US, is like mostly well aligned. It's like, it's close. But then this idea that it's a third party, right? So in Prince George's County, they hired a third party to actually do the work of figuring out like, okay, what does Common Core look like? How do we train teachers? How do we support teachers? So there's this game of translation that's happening as we kind of move towards the rhetoric and towards the classroom. So there's really the fundamental question of this kind of reform, right? Which is, okay, we have new standards. The standards aren't going to teach the kids. The teachers are going to teach the kids. So what does it mean? What does Common Core aligned teaching look like? That's the question that every district and every teacher who teaches in a Common Core district or any other, advanced standard district is asking, right? And so the new expectations, they're targeted at students and what students should do, and they sort of imply what teachers should do, right? The practices that teachers should be following, right? But there's clearly a lack of clarity in what exactly is it that teachers are supposed to do. And if you're a district trying to figure that out and support it or measure it, there's clearly a problem here. And that problem, we argue in the paper, and I would argue is just basically generally the way things operate in most districts, is that gap of like, okay, what do the standards actually mean for teachers? That question is most often answered through observational rubrics that are actually used to assess teachers and sometimes to support them. So the rubrics are actually doing the translation. They're doing that bridging work. And so rubrics become the tool, I would argue, but there are others, for communicating expectations about what instructional quality really looks like when we talk about new standards. And we know from prior research that teachers will align their instruction to what's in the rubrics. And that when we work with coaches, the coaches are often going to align their support to these things. So they become really consequential, right? So this is like a classic, again, for the school reform folks, right? This is like a classic example, right, of where the enacted reform is the reform, right? Whatever the rhetoric said before, like the reform is what's enacted. And so, what gets measured gets taught, what gets measured determines how it gets taught. So this is the teacher version of basically, in my view, what we did with No Child Left Behind, right? And so it raises the possibility, and this is really the crux of the paper, of misalignment between the definitions of quality that are embedded or implied in the standards and what we're actually doing in terms of building systems and building rubrics to observe them. And that's the question. That was like the big question at the heart of the paper was is there a misalignment, right? You can like hint, yeah, there was. I've said a lot about, implied a definition of instructional quality, but just to lay it out, because this is something I think is important, right? This is not simply teacher behaviors, and it's not simply materials. I'm not dissing anyone's work in saying this, but like, a textbook, whatever its inherent quality, doesn't do anything in the classroom unless it's like brought into conversation with students. So we can assess the quality of textbooks all we want, and that's a precursor, right? That's a precondition for maybe a successful teaching moment, but it's not an end in itself, right? And so, and nor is just disembodied practice. Again, I'm not dissing the Met project or anything like that, but we can atomize these things, but at least when we think about instructional quality in the paper, we're thinking of it as fundamentally relational and contextual, right? It has to exist in a place, and it has to be an interaction between teachers, students, and materials. And, so we're focusing on the experiences, how do individual teachers support students in classroom interactions, how teachers within schools coordinate their experiences, right? That's the contextual piece, right? And then the sort of how they come together, right? The tasks, texts, and learning activities a teacher selects, right? For a specific set of students, for a specific curriculum. And so it's really the nexus of those things, right? And again, that's our view. I think it's a good view, but that there are different approaches to this, but that's how we're thinking of it. And that's how, as I'll talk about in a second, that's how we think the standards are imagining what instructional equality means. So really we're thinking about how do we actually identify this in practice? How do we support instructional quality? And here you get a set of, like, I think quite interesting and quite theoretical issues. In my view, they're having thought a lot about teacher value added work, and having thought a lot about the sort of high stakes decisions that were made under the value added models, and especially in Florida and stuff. There were a bunch of lawsuits about kind of what kinds of ideas could we have and how should we think about this. And so it really comes down to, like, is instructional quality the characteristic of an individual teacher? Is it a set of teachers? Is it an entire teaching core across a grade? Is it a school phenomenon? We kind of got to punt this question in the last round of policy, but I think the more that we push for high quality teaching and the more we take seriously supporting it, the more we kind of find this question. I think we have to think harder about it. There's also the other related things is, like, what is the relationship among instructional quality, curriculum, and instructional materials? Teachers don't, or we don't always want them to just invent stuff. So part of it is, maybe some teachers can reach higher heights because they have better materials. And that's where, like, textbook quality and all that stuff comes in. And other teachers are going to be constrained, they're going to be limited, especially in light of, maybe more aggressive, if we're entering a period of more aggressive overseeing of what text can enter a classroom, what text cannot enter a classroom, topics that can be addressed and ones that cannot be addressed. Then we need to really think about, like, what does that mean for how we think about what a teacher is doing with their classroom. And so to the extent, and this is the big one, right? To what extent is instructional quality even a visible characteristic of classroom interactions? So is it something I can go and observe? Or is it something else? And I think, the answer is it's going to be a little bit of both, as it always is. Are there invisible pieces? And this is the part where, when we get to Q&A, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about, like, are there invisible but nevertheless crucial pieces, and either invisible because they're literally invisible, or invisible because they are functionally invisible, as in it would not be possible to design a system that could observe them. And so I encourage you to think about, are there invisible pieces of instructional quality that we need to consider as we begin to make these build systems that actually do support instructional quality. So we look at rubrics, as I said before, right? Because any rubric is going to select certain things to focus on. That's, like, literally what its job is. Focus on certain things, not focus on other things. It's going to be that thing that translates. And this is just a classic problem, right? I'm not picking on rubrics. Any policy, you're going to have to decide what is it that you're going to look at? How are you going to assess it? And also we selected rubrics for this paper because they're everywhere. They're, every district. I mean, part of it is because they are high stakes, because they're written into contracts, they're often prescribed in a way. And so they're there. We know that districts are investing heavily in observation systems, and different rubrics require different evidentiary standards in terms of what is actually being observed. How do you observe it? What kinds of evidence does someone use? And they're used for high stakes decisions and support, right? And so this is just a feature. That's why we focus on them, though you could imagine, I think, this paper with looking at other things. Now, here's our take on the assumptions that most rubrics make about instructional quality right now, that an individual lesson is an appropriate unit for analysis. That if I look at a lesson, I'm actually observing something about instructional quality. And it's worth thinking about whether this is the case, whether this ought to be the case, or whether it might not be the case at all, right? We also think about an individual teacher as being the personal quality purveyor, right? This is what value added means. This is what we do when we're trying to, like, assess a teacher's quality. It's that the teacher is the quality purveyor in the classroom, right? That's why I observe the teacher and the students, not something else. And that instructional quality is fundamentally a visible feature of the classroom, right? It can be seen by an observer. And as a historian, I would say that this goes all the way back to the 19th century when we had school inspectors. Like, we always have assumed that teaching is something that is visible and that any outsider with training should be able to walk in and immediately spot it. And maybe there's intuition there that we need to keep, right? But we also need to consider the possibility that observation protocols might be poorly equipped to capture certain kinds of instructional quality given our new standards. We tried to, in the paper, I had many iterations of this graph, but this is essentially what I've been trying to say in a nutshell. When we look at, so the solid line is it what we can see in an observation. So you have like the instructional triangle, materials, teacher, student, and I can see a lesson and I can see the interaction, and we believe that this is a measure of instructional quality. And usually I can see multiple lessons, right? I can like fill in more, right, by seeing more lessons, and I can see a sequence. What we don't yet really capture in observational quality and instructional quality through our current rubrics is all the things that happen backstage or the sort of the pre-planning, right? So we don't really see the relationship between prior lessons or prior planning and what actually happens. We don't necessarily see how yesterday's botched lesson or yesterday's fantastic lesson maybe led us in a direction this morning or the next day or a month ago, right? So we believe that by showing up, we can do at least an adequate job. I'm not saying that everyone says like, of course this is the best version, but that's how our systems are built. That's how we make these decisions. So there's this sort of off camera, out of view thing, and it gets brought in some ways, but not in all ways. And it's worth thinking about that again in light of our standards, right? So what a teacher does in front of the classroom may not be may no longer be an adequate view. That's the thing. So just a little bit of context. So this was a theoretical paper that we got to merge with some actual practice, which is always nice. Graduate students, like, write your theoretical paper and also write the practical version. The key here is that Washington, D.C., Julie and her colleagues, her students, right, were working with DC, which is interesting because DC was really foregrounded, really hit the ground running with its value added take, and was really interested in the sort of assessment side, but they were also really interested in helping teachers make this transition from pre-Common Core instruction to Common Core aligned instruction. And so they were working with, DC wanted to do a concerted effort to create a professional development district-wide to support Common Core teaching. And they actually created this initiative, the Learning Together to Advance Our Practice, to support teachers through this transition from non-Common Core to Common Core aligned. And they partnered with student achievement partners to try to modify or develop protocols for reliable classroom observation. So they were really trying, and again, DC did what a lot of districts wouldn't do, which is actually not just say like, oh, let's import our old observation and have at it. Like, they did exactly what I think as policy folks we would want them to do, which is, okay, we have a new policy, we need to provide professional support, we need to go through a period of thinking and study about how do we actually do this in a thoughtful way. So, I want to highlight, like, this is exactly what we would want a district to do in thinking about it. And so they developed a protocol, and this is where Julie and her students really worked to develop a protocol. And then they captured and coded 1,000 lessons using this protocol in grades 3 through 5, mathematics and language arts. And they were really focused on 3 particular aspects of this shift. So in mathematics, right, looking at Common Core standards, the focus on focusing on grade-specific foundational topics and adequate depth, right? That's a key feature in math. Building content connections across and within grades, and attending to conceptual understanding, procedures, procedural skill and fluency, and the application of knowledge with equal intensity. So not just focusing on the sort of procedural skill, not just focusing on application, but balancing, right? That was a key feature. And in English language arts, right, same three focuses that they were particularly interested on focusing their observational rubric on to support teachers in making this transition, right? So one, regularly focusing on grade level complex texts, right? And making sure that students develop the vocabulary necessary to engage those texts, grounding reading, writing, and speaking skills in text-based evidence, and building content knowledge through the inclusion of content-rich nonfiction texts. And we all know that made like the balance of nonfiction and fiction. And it's not that these three aspects of the Common Core standards were not in prior DC versions, but this was the thing that the district felt like these are aspects that are going to be emphasized under Common Core, and we want to support teachers through this transition. So we want to make sure our observational rubrics can capture whether this is happening so that we can support teachers. It was not intended to be, high stakes. This was intended to be formative evaluation. So that's the context in which they were thinking about this and actually tried to do it. And so the good news is that some aspects of what Common Core was calling for were indeed able to be captured through the observational rubric, right? So visible aspects, the ELA standards focus on student engagement with grade level texts, right? And so, one key piece that the observational rubrics were homed in on was, whether teachers were asking text dependent questions. So what is the author's purpose in the text, right? And really directing students' attention to the text, right? And this is something that in a classroom, in a single lesson, you could, and they did successfully observe. And they even developed a second aspect to this rubric, which was whether they were asking not just text dependent questions, so a question rooted in the text, but text specific questions, like why does the author include the images on page 21? So thinking about and pushing the students to not just think about the text in the abstract, but to actually engage with the text as such. So, pushing the students, and this is something that I think we would all agree is, now we can talk about, the frequency that a teacher does it, or whether they do it when the person is present and only when the person is present. But like, those are sort of like that. Okay, that's an endemic problem to observations, perhaps. But these are things that we could observe. They are things that are in the standards, and they are things that we can observe through a protocol. And this this was elaborated, right? They made a distinction here in the observational protocol in thinking about it between generic text-dependent questions and then text-specific questions. And the same was true in math. The math practice required students to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, right? And so it was possible in the context of observing these lessons to see how often and to what degree students were provided opportunities for justification and critique of their own mathematical reasoning and the reasoning of others or in problems, right? And it was also possible in talking about the exchange, and this is where instructional quality as a relational quality is important, right? To hear how the teacher directed student behavior, followed up on questions, asked questions or didn't ask questions, corrected errors, all those things, right? To sort of plumb students' depth of argumentation and reasoning. So this was all stuff that, higher level, asking more, and that we felt like, okay, the observational rubrics could meet that challenge. Okay, so that's good. It's nice to know that things sometimes work. But there were also parts of the standards that, in thinking about, again, how to do this in practice, right, to actually solve a problem that a district had come with, there were invisible parts. There were parts that it did not seem that the rubric could be written to capture. And so to rehash, right, one was the problem of simply the single lesson as the fundamental unit of analysis, right? DC, like a lot of districts, right? The lesson is the unit. That's how the rubrics are situated. That's how the whole system operates. And there's something, I mean, it's always easy to say like, we'll do more lessons, but when you multiply that by the number of teachers, by the number of hours that an assistant principal or instructional leader has, like, okay, so I mean, again, it's not a critique. We're just recognizing the sort of like, you run up against some of these problems. So, what the question of what could actually be ascertained in a single lesson, the standards emphasize sequencing, both within a lesson and across units and across grades. And this became an extremely difficult problem to handle with the observational rubrics in terms of whether this was actually happening, right? Could we ascertain that it was happening? Connections across grade levels, vertical trajectories of ideas and sort of how they're being integrated. These connections are, many people would argue, and at least the standards seem to imply in the way that they're written and in the way that they formulate it, that sort of the idea of sequencing, the idea of making connections is key to reaching the highest levels of the standards. So it's right. So this is not the point is, this is not a minor problem that we can't do this. This seems to go to the heart of the framing of these standards as getting us to the next level, getting us to higher levels of student achievement or more complex thought on the part of students. And then there was the problem of materials and curricular resources. So there's the unit of analysis problem, and then there's the materials and resources problem. The standards emphasize specific texts in language arts, both in terms of the grade level, the appropriateness, and in terms of genre. And unless you reduce the selection of text to something mechanical, right? It's on an approved list, or it has a certain Lexile score, right? Something that is verifiable. Maybe I can't verify it in the moment, but I can look at it and I can then say like, okay, that was an appropriate text. But if you don't simply pick a binary like yes appropriate, no appropriate, and one that is decontextualized, right? A book on a list is on the list for all students, presumably everyone in a grade level. It's really hard to think about how you would decide whether the teacher had made an appropriate choice without a heroic, possibly heroic endeavor, right? So this became a real challenge. So just to unpack these a little bit more. The challenge of a single language, single lesson as a unit of analysis in mathematics, right? The standards call for teachers to pursue conceptual understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and application with equal intensity, right? So again, this balance of this equal intensity is expected at the topic level, right? Within a series of lessons, and also, possibly within a lesson. But by looking at one lesson or even multiple lessons, you're not going to be able to make a claim about whether this is being pursued with equal intensity. Like that's what the standard calls for. And it became functionally impossible to actually verify that piece. Now, again, you can wave your hand at it and say, well, that's not actually important. And maybe that's true. But if we're taking the standards seriously and trying to implement them, it seems like it creates a little bit of a rub. In English language arts, something that was important, right? It called the standards call for a balance between fiction and nonfiction texts, right? So they recommend a ratio of 50-50 across the year. And so it was not possible. Again, these are not things that are visible to someone sitting in the lesson. Now, again, you can think of ways around this. You could imagine saying like, we'll submit a list of all the texts. Okay, well, sure. Now you're getting into a different kind of verification, not even necessarily verification, right? You're getting into a different realm of like how you're going to assess instructional quality. And just me, you're trending more towards formalism. Like there's something nice about saying like, I'm going to show up and I'm going to see someone do something. And I'm going to, even if you don't think there's a science, you just think it's closer to an aesthetic, right? At least I can be there to judge. the more that you offload onto like, well, they're going to write reports, they're going to stipulate what texts are being used. Well, now you're much more in the realm of a formalism than you are in an enacted practice. So there, and again, if you think that the text relates to what's happening and it's the interaction with the text, then a list of what texts are used, again, it only barely reaches the underlying construct, right? Which is a teacher and a class and students engaging with a text, not a list of a text. So these are the kinds of problems that were raised in practice. Again, not to belabor the point, right? But when you think about the selection of tasks and curricular resources, the English language arts, specifically, the standards call for a three-pronged approach, that the teacher considers the range of texts that meet the quantitative criteria, right, that have the appropriate Lexile score. The teacher reads the text and considers the meaning, the structure, the language, and the knowledge demands to make sure they're appropriate. And then that the teacher considers the match between the text, the reader, and then the goals of the lesson, right? So there's this sort of interactive dimension. And again, not possible in simply an observational protocol to assess whether this has been done or whether it's been done well. And so only the final selection is visible, right? And so, and again, you might think about saying, okay, well, again, does it matter whether you can think of lots of ways in which teachers might have arrived at the answer or have figured out, especially this last bullet about thinking about appropriateness. I could have asked other teachers. I could have gone online. I could have gone on Twitter. I could have consulted people, so you have to think about like, well, again, if you're going to ask for more evidence, like, well, what kinds of things would you want to position yourself to look for? And then what would you look for? What would be an acceptable a way of reaching this? And again, the more that it becomes a communal choice, the less, I would argue, instructional quality is a feature of an individual as opposed to a set of individuals or a school or a community or a learning community. So again, different pathways will lead you, I think, towards different definitions of what it means. In math, same thing. Here, it's not so much a problem of it not being visible as putting higher demands on the actual person who's rating. So in math, those of you who are familiar, right? A problem that requires the same math calculation meets different standards depending on how it's presented. So in third grade, we get, the multiplication of two numbers, right? Gabriel had 3 pots, he planted 7 seeds in each pot. How many did he have? In fourth grade, the idea is the standard calls for mathematical comparisons, right? So it's the same calculation, but depending on how the problem is actually presented to the student, you might either be meeting or not meeting that grade level standard. And so it just puts a higher demand on the person who's observing to really know the standard and understand how the teacher is using it and whether they're using it appropriately. So just to wrap up, and then I want to engage with you and hear your thoughts and kind of, we need to, there's like a second paper to be written here about how we take this next step. We're really identifying problems, and now I like to solve things as well as create problems. So we have a challenge, I think, for this new era. One way that we phrase it in the paper, and one way I like to think of it, right, is we've moved from an emphasis on what is taught. We've moved towards what is taught rather than how it's taught, right? So many of our current protocols were developed in an era where we were really interested in figuring out whether teachers were doing certain things. And we were really, because they were attached to really high stakes decisions, we needed to make sure that we could reliably measure these pedagogical things, whether these things were either happening or not, or whether we could watch a video, verify that it was happening, so that if it wasn't happening, we could reasonably, take an action, right, against someone. So, we started with a series of measures that were designed for certain purposes and needed to have certain characteristics because of their use. And now we're entering, I would argue, maybe a different stage, right? So we've started with an emphasis on the visible, the verifiable, the atomized. and things that can be decontextualized. I can watch a video of the lesson and not know anything else about it to determine whether a teacher is doing the right things in their classroom to give us confidence in that teacher. And I want to stress, I don't think this is an unreasonable approach, right? There is a place for, there are many instances where we want to know whether a teacher has a certain technique, approach in their repertoire, right? We see this a lot in licensure, where we need to know whether a teacher can do it at all, and that the verification of that is valuable in and of itself. But that might not always be the thing we want to know, and it might not be the sort of the end of our discussion about instructional quality. So we have to think about that. We need to think about how we capture, and whether we need to capture how teachers make choices about what's going on in the lesson, right? So that's the off-camera stuff. This often requires contextual knowledge. What is happening when, in what order, given what prior history in that classroom or with those students. And so those are complicated questions to answer. There are also new demands on raters, and I don't think we can understate this, right? You can get a really fancy new rubric, but if we don't have people who can use those rubrics reliably and with fidelity, then you don't have a new rubric. I mean, you do, but you don't functionally, right? So so they need to know things like being able to assess whether a text has a grade level fit. They need to know which mathematical standards are associated with what tasks and how a teacher might be using them fluidly and thoughtfully. This is like the old, this is not like you write the learning objective on the chalkboard, right? Like we're so far from those sorts of things like, yep, there is a bulletin board in the classroom. Like these are not things that are just like up, down anymore, or maybe maybe they shouldn't be. And that we need to recognize, right? Again, and this goes to sort of scale, we really need to think about the constraints or the affordances that an individual teacher has in a classroom, in a district, and think about, again, these might be school-wide, these might be grade level wide, they might be individual, but thinking about how a teacher's choice is not totally free, and different teachers in different contexts, we might want to make different choices. And so figuring out a way to incorporate that, again, becomes really important when we think about the scale of these sorts of things. So again, I'd invite you to think back to this thing. I said, this is how we currently do it. And you can imagine, right? We asked, Jacob and I and Jessica and maybe other people on this call, like, if you think about something like EdTPA, we ask teachers, when they're going up for licensure, to talk to us about their thinking, right? It's basically reflections on teaching. And people critique the heck out of that, right? That we're not really assessing what teachers are doing. We're assessing whether they can reflect on their practice and what's the value of reflecting on the practice. And again, so for my taste, like we just haven't thought enough about the relationship here between, how important, I mean, the standards say that the choices and the sequencing and the connections are really important. But I haven't seen a lot of thought about how do we incorporate that into our thinking about instructional quality. How would we do it? How can we think about those interactions? What do we want to do in thinking about the gap between, again, the planning and what happens? We want teachers to be spontaneous. We want them to take a moment that exists. So again, you don't want to over determine our observational protocols, but the more that you leave open, the more demands are on the people who are going to implement it. So there's a complexity to it. There's also this question of like the number of observations, right? I was giving this presentation to other people. They're like, well, we'll just do more observations. Okay, I guess if you can find the time and the money, but then there are other questions about, we really need, and again, doctoral students, here's some ideas. We basically know nothing about, how many, well, we have a little knowledge about, sampling, So how often do we have to see a teacher before we have a good sense? How many lessons do we need to observe before we can make inferences? And we have a little work on this, but not maybe as much as we'd like. We have no sense about like spacing or the optimal intervals between lessons. Teachers and their classes develop a dynamic, they develop a rapport. So maybe they're really, it's really important whether we see spring lessons or fall lessons or need some of both. So there are complexities here. And again, we can guess, but we don't really have good information to do it. And I think of it like a lot of it, what we do in education is we retrofit. We have these systems in place and we try to like hack them together and kind of Frankenstein them to work. And we may need to be reaching a point where we need to really redesign. And that's why I want to, congratulate DC on really thinking about this, but even their advanced planning, they ran into some problems. So we need to disentangle maybe the formative and summative pieces of evaluation, develop maybe more robust systems in the language we use in the paper is, a wider aperture. So maybe the pre-planning and the actual things and other kinds of evidence, and reduce our reliance on individual snapshots, marshaling, new resources and new supports, training for observers, coaches, we're getting a lot of data on that. So thinking about how it all comes together to create a more robust a way of observing, and so that we can begin to see the things that currently we can't see. And so I'll end it there. Questions, comments, thoughts? I'm looking forward to hearing your reactions, your ideas. Thanks for joining me on your lunch hour.
Thank you so much, Ethan. That was fantastic. Joe, do you want to go ahead and ask your question just so the recording catches it and everything?
Sure thing. I'll just read right off the chat. So Dr. Hutt, this was such a fascinating talk. I'm curious about your opinion about how this conversation translates to subjects outside of ELA and math. Does that conversation even exist? And if so, how are researchers and policymakers wrapping their heads around how to assess instructional quality, especially in subjects that are substantively, I should say, they're structured differently from the two most commonly tested ones?
I mean, I think it's a great question. And for there are probably some people in the chat and may know better. I mean, as far as I know, this is barely happening in ELA and math. And I don't, I mean, in my field, in history and social studies and stuff, no, I mean, I don't hear people talking about these things or thinking about how we might do it. And then you have the problem that you're gesturing towards, right? Which is, for basically over, almost now 2 decades, makes me feel old about how long I've been doing this. We've been making this argument that of course, math and English are super important, but there are lots of other standards. I mean, what does this look like in science? What does this look like in social studies and history? And, if I were in those fields, I would hope that we could generate some conversation around this, because we all know that, we all know that teachers get better. We want to support them, but that that so much of what moves instruction and moves attention in districts are these rubrics, are the sort of procedural dimensions. And so I think that the other question you raised, right, the more we think of these pedagogical practices not as free-floating things, but as deeply intertwined with specific texts, specific kinds of inquiries, we need raters and people who are going to have very specific and specialized knowledge, very intimate knowledge of what historical reasoning looks like, what are the appropriate texts that one could pick if one was using primary sources or other kinds, yes. And so you've just 2x'd the complexity of who is capable of doing these things. And that's really, in my view, the problem is it's well and good to push higher, but now the whole system needs to push higher with it. And that's that's a professional development problem. That's a recruitment problem. That's all those things. And then it ratchets out. Again, if you don't think pedagogical practices are free floating, then the coaches need it too. And all the people that we rely on. So it's a great question. I hope you'll work on it because it sounds like it's too much for me. So I hope some people on this call are jumping in. People just read your question. Jacob, you direct traffic.
Yeah, Jesse, if you want to read your question, or I can read it. whatever works.
I can read it. Can you
Okay,
hear
great.
me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hutt, for that interesting topic. And also just want to say it's nice to see another North Carolinian here today. My question involves issues of culture. And so with the current climate of banning discussions about race in schools and the overall misunderstanding of critical race theory, is there any space for meaningful consideration of more schools utilizing a multicultural or culturally responsive approach in the efforts to improve the quality of instruction? Sorry.
I mean, candidly, I think this is where we want to maybe occasionally sing the praises of a certain decentralization in our school system, where the truth is it's now in pockets, right? I mean, in North Carolina, it is probably not possible to do this at a statewide level. In California, it might be, or in districts in California, it might be. I mean, I think one of the things you're going to see, again, this is me speaking as a historian now, is, we have seen historically, a sort of a accordion effect where people, when they're in the political ascendancy, they push for more centralization. States should make these choices. The federal government should make these choices. And then when they're not, then they push like, well, no, we need local control. This is really something that should be decided on schools level. So I think you're going to see kind of maybe a reversing of course, where people who were once kind of more adamant about kind of centralized discussion are going to now find a new reason to embrace, districts, not being required to use certain texts. Or maybe, I mean, again, this is one where be careful what we build, that the inability to observe what goes on in every classroom maybe is a good thing. So teachers find individual ways, but as a formal matter, right, are there ways to incorporate this? I think there absolutely are. And again, another competency we would want a rater to have, or another feature, right? We talk about relational and we talk about relevance in the classroom, there are absolutely ways that you could embed more multicultural, more culturally sensitive things into these rubrics. If it were me, if that were something I were passionate about, like the way that things work in the US and in our schools is we need someone to develop it. We need people to try to use it. And then it's political. We need people to give a groundswell of support behind it to push it forward. And so if I were a graduate student, if I were someone who were thinking along these lines, build it, pilot it, you need these things available when the political moment is right. And so I would encourage people to press forward, even in a difficult political environment, because they're always fertile soil for growth, even in times when it's challenging.
Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hutt. Question for you is, have you done any, I haven't read the paper, of course, but have you done anything about mini observations, as more of a formative, trying to, observations as they exist in, at least I can talk about Texas, is pretty much it's a binary thing. Are you an idiot or not? And we need to move you on. But trying to make you a better teacher, I'm not really sure we spend a lot of time on that. So some of the stuff I've read talked about that.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the thing, right? It's like a lot of it is trying to decide in your, I love that formulation. Are you an idiot or not? And this is like the old, you send a school inspector in to see if the place actually is like fair, and so, I think that's the idea of trying to actually develop some systems that can, and that's why I think, thinking about like the actual thought process, like a lesson could be unsuccessful for so many reasons, or I might come in and it's because of something that happened yesterday, or something that is happening like in the moment, like something I need to handle with my class on this day. Now, when you said mini, did you mean like I might not have to watch a whole period, like I could be like 10-minute, like something like that?
That some of the I took a principles course, and this,
yeah, well, tell me more. Tell me more about that. I mean, what's the idea?
180 days in 6 periods, that's over 1,000 classes, and they're going to come one day.
Yeah,
so it's less than 1/10 of 1%.
Yeah.
and I can be pretty darn good for 45 minutes a year, but if I come, anytime you're coming in the next 2 weeks, so we kind of know what it's going to be. But if I come to everybody, it takes 45 minutes, so I can do 4 observations. Not necessarily, but I mean, you kind of get the idea that maybe 3 observations in a period, and you don't know when they're coming, and you can look at music, and you can look at social studies, you can look at other things, and you can kind of see. I think if you're a principal or assistant principal, you've been doing it a while, you kind of tell pretty quick they got it or they don't. And hey, and let's talk about it, because that's the other thing. A week maybe to get back to me to tell me how I did, and how good is the feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question, which is, I mean, what you're saying is like, this goes to that sampling thing, is like, how much of a lesson do I really need to, how much does like a moment to moment lesson score, for lack of a better term, like, a lot of people would say, like, as you say, like, if I walk in, I can, if I'm very good, right? I'm a very experienced educator, I can see in a single interaction whether this is a good teacher or not, right? So, I mean, and if we take that seriously, then it might be possible to do that kind of thing. And also, again, and this goes back to is it evaluative? Like, I do a lot of stuff with like courts. And when you're going to say like, well, this person's value added score was X, therefore we did not renew them. Like, the evidentiary quality of that score needs to have certain properties. It needs to be defensible on certain grounds, which, again, I think teachers and principals are they're professionals, they're artisans, they're all those things. And so maybe it is empowering principals to do what you're talking about, but in a systematic way that we can make sure that it's happening and that support is being provided. But again, like, this sort of like, I can tell a knot and I can immediately grasp a problem. Maybe that is a better model. And we don't need the sort of formalism of a rubric. Again, that, thinking through that would be actually a really interesting thought exercise, really interesting paper. So I would encourage you to think more about that.
Ethan, I'm going to read a question from Levi. Dr. Hutt, do you have any thoughts on how all this intersects with teacher workforce issues? A big part of why I chose not to go into K through 12 was a desire for autonomy and a lack of interest in dealing with the practical burden that can be created by good faith efforts to engage in the work of assessing teacher quality. Do you see a trade-off in getting the assessment right versus chasing off needed talent?
100%. I mean, so again, like, this Levi, I think you're just a gray screen, but like, I think you've exactly hit the nail on the head, which is there's absolutely a trade-off. And this is why, in the opening, I said, like, there's both an equity and an excellence component to this, right? We want teachers to be better. We want them to be more ambitious in their instruction. But unfortunately, we also have a system where there are a lot of schools and instructional moments and interactions that are not where we want them to be. They're inadequate. They're not equitable. And so, thinking about trying to direct attention and focusing in on things that we think are important, like, becomes a response to these things. So it's not just hey, we're gonna punish the teachers by watching over their shoulder. It's like, no, we want to improve, right? We want to help people like become professionals. So there's absolutely a trade-off, which is why I like Mike's suggestion, right? That, like, what would it mean to develop like a purely like artisanal view of, an observation rubric, the sort of like, we know it when we see it, the sort of like, I kind of wander through the halls of my school and I can hear moments of great joy and excitement. Like, I mean, again, like, push it as far as you can, right? It's going to break down. But I think that is the kind of thinking we need, both for the reasons that you're saying, but also because I think the more ambitious the teaching is, the more we want, the less likely it's going to be amenable to a kind of like observational, like yes, no rubric, or even like a score. Like, what does it mean to score really high level thinking, right? Like, again, it breaks down at the edges. So, I mean, I would really encourage that we're in the sort of 2.0, 3.0 of this sort of thinking. And maybe we can move further away from value added scores and towards something a little different. I don't know. Yeah,
All
I
right.
see the iterator reliability. See, that's the question, right? Like, do you need that? And that's the big challenge. Sorry.
No, you're good. Well, thanks, Ethan. We're gonna respect your time. Thank you for giving us the hour, and thank you for everyone else for joining us. Just a couple housekeeping things. I hope you all will join us for our next Brown Bag Talk. It's scheduled for February 15th. Same time, the lunch hour, noon to 1. Dr. Emily Anderson from Florida International University will be joining us. And then thanks so much, Ethan. This talk recording will be available on our YouTube channel and posted and tweeted and all the good things. But yeah, and then Ethan's put his email there in the chat in case anybody would like to follow up. I know a couple of you had messaged me some questions if there was time, but Ethan also has a great Twitter, so another good model of how to, use it for some good.
My favorite thing is to brainstorm ideas. So doctoral students, any student or friend of Jacob's is a friend of mine. So feel free to reach out by email, by Twitter, whatever makes you happy. Happy to talk through ideas, happy to just connect, because especially because who knows when we'll ever get to gather in person again. So please don't be shy about reaching out. Really happy to chat with you and connect and just hear about your work, chat ideas, whatever makes you happy.
And as someone who I view Ethan as one of my greatest mentors in graduate school, he means that, trust me. So thank you all, and thanks again, Ethan, for joining us. See you all next time.
Thanks, guys. Talk soon.